Hello everyone, this is Game Philosopher, and today we're going to be talking about logic. Now, logic is something that a lot of people misinterpret because a lot of times people are focusing on the informal logic, not so much on the formal logic. Both are good, and a lot of people make different arguments of which is often of bad quality. So, for example, you might have people who take a statistic and say, well, this will always be the case that, something is true, even if it might be a majority in a statistic, or someone might say, that's just anecdotal evidence. Now, I'm not going to be talking about those two things right here today. That's going to be for a different video, a later video, because this is actually being a planned series. And yet, the first part of the series is what I'm talking about right now. Now, today, it's pretty much a society that we see where soundbites matter. So you go on TV, you ask, or you don't ask, you listen to the different politicians speak, and these different politicians will say this or that. You don't even listen to the whole thing a lot of times. A lot of times the news will take this statement or that statement and say, this guy is a socialist, this guy is whatever. Or, he might take this guy's one virtuous thing and say, uh, that this charity is a great thing, and they might ignore all these other small things over here that might not look so good. So we have a soundbite type society. In fact, most of my videos won't even fit in the society, and that's because people have a short attention span, and in a short attention span type environments, it's not as ideal as it is to say, well, I believe this premise because blah blah blah, then this premise blah blah blah, then therefore blah blah blah. What happens is people will not get past the first premise because you're busy arguing and trying to prove each premise. Now, this is actually somewhat of a danger in today's society because you also have these deconstruction types of people who will try to pick apart your argument and say, this is not the case because, this reason, that reason, or whatever. But there is a way around this. And yet there are some problems with this particular method. But I'll be covering that all here. So, the syllogism. What is the syllogism? So, the most classic example of it is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Um, yeah, stuff like this. Now, for such a thing as that Socrates is immortal uh, example, what happens is that there's not really much you can do to say beyond that all men are mortal because it seems like it would kind of make sense that all men are mortal, and so you get this syllogism that's done almost perfectly. You don't need any extra things to prove this point, therefore this point. So what happens is you have this summed up idea very quickly, and it's so pithy and so well tied together that it's going to be really easy for someone to say whether or not they agree with this conclusion and all the premises, or why they might agree with it or why they might disagree with it. Um, Now, for other syllogisms where it's not so easy, the terms are not so obvious, no matter what, you're going to have to try to prove, X is the case, if X, therefore Y, and, if all X's are Y, then, pretty much stuff like that. And for this, I'd have to say that a lot of it has to do with organization. And uh, ideally speaking, when you're doing your argument, you're not just going to have one syllogism. In my opinion, the best way to deal with all this is you have premise one. As a proposition, you list in if you're doing it in written standpoint, it's going to be like proposition one, X is the case, or if X, then Y. Then you're going to just syllogism proving if X is then Y. Then you move on to the next one, using the conclusion. If my conclusion is right, therefore this other premise. Then you try to prove this other premise within the idea of if x then y. Then you move on. Then you keep going as far as you need to do that conclusion. And if you do it this way, it's very simple that you could actually take a whole entire a big formal long argument and simplify it down within three premises. Now, in the case of things that are so complex that you can't do it within three premises, or four, you have to do four, I'd have to say then you have to mix between the propositional logic, which is the logic of having all these propositions until almost disorganized, well, not disorganized, but proving it by these propositions that may or may not be connected, but it's not so formal as the syllogism. Uh, so you might have to say, okay, these four premises, therefore this, such as the master argument or any other famous argument in history. Now, yet at the same time, what I'm arguing for is that, in the long premise or the long form of this argument, you have this long, long discourse, and they're all connected, they're all interwoven, and you're able to fight any sort of thing that might be going on, uh, that you might be commenting on. And you might be able to make it firm. Not everyone will agree with you, but it's going to still be firm. Now, as to the shorthand, that is the syllogism. This called shorthand argument. You only have three premises. Uh, your premise one, premise two, conclusion. It's not going to be so difficult. It's actually pretty concise, and that's, in my opinion, the conciseness is exactly what you need in a society like today, where people are always talking about soundbites. So if someone goes up to you in the news and says, "What do you mean? What do you think about this?" Throw them a syllogism. Within that, you should be fine. Now, if someone tries to ask you, why do you believe this premise or that premise or that premise, always keep in mind your longhand argument. And with your longhand argument, you could draw within your memory the reason why this premise might be true and that premise might be true. Then you then can argue with a proper dialogue, and this should work to your advantage. Now, giving some last minute hints on this, a lot of people confuse solemnness with validity, and I actually made this little joke saying that uh, Aristotle is a Bulgarian, even though he's not, to demonstrate this once in actually a Facebook group where, you know, pretty much I was arguing that all people from uh, Stagira are from Macedon. All Macedonians are Bulgarian. Therefore, Aristotle is a Bulgarian. Now, this is not really true because, for one, I think Stagira is actually on the Greek side, but even considering that modern day Macedonia is Bulgaria, back in the past, it was not the case. Actually, back then, the Bulgarians were somewhere else, and pretty much Macedonia was Greek. And so the thing is, you have to look at logic not so much as truth in itself, but rather logic as in how things are argued and understood. Now, something could be logical, but not true, like the Bulgarian syllogism about Aristotle being Bulgarian. Um, and a lot of philosophers would call that validity, but not soundness. Now, if I were to say something arguing that Aristotle is Greek, based off of what are the facts, it becomes a sound argument, because no one's going to be able to say that's not quite true. And so I'd have to say, as a closing hint, that you really want to make sure, to the best of your ability, to make sure that your arguments are as sound as possible, because there are always degrees of soundness within an argument. And it's all based off your understanding. Now, if you have the best argument for how you understand this, that's perfect. That's actually what you want. But you should always keep an open mind. So when you're discussing things, always try to listen to what your opponent or your no, I'm not even going to say opponent, because the opponent's actually more of a uh, thing of, this guy's an enemy, but he's not really an enemy. He's just someone you disagree with. So you listen to their perspective, you ask them questions, you try to learn from them. That way you can mold your argument around towards a more sound point, because ultimately speaking, we want truth. And Aristotle even said at one point that um, the mark of an educated mind is someone who could actually be able to entertain ideas, even if they disagree with it. Now, that was a paraphrase, but it's exactly what he said in terms of meaning. And um, if you want to learn more about argumentation, I'm going to show some of my favorite books. The Principia Mathematica by Bertrand Russell is one which would recommend if people could actually take the time to try to learn the symbolic logic. But before doing that, I probably will do that in a later video after explaining all that stuff. But you have the Organon, which is the classic on logic that Aristotle wrote. Now you can buy his individual treatises within this little uh, collection, but I'd say it's best to get the full book. And this actual copy I have right here is actually pretty expensive right now, because I think it's out of print, but you could probably find definitely a $15 version of Organon somewhere. The Metalogicon by John Salisbury. Now, this is, of course, a lot of people who are in the analytic tradition will know what metalogic is, and it's pretty much looking at systems of logic and how we uh, understand logic and all. This book actually goes on grammar. It goes on, ways of lecturing logic, and uh, argues based off of things like the posterior analytics and all, and why Aristotle has been called the philosopher par excellence and all, and the utility of sophistry and all. So this is a really good book to considering logic. It's not so much a book that's based off of uh, how to logic. In fact, this is the best book on how to logic and dialogue. Now the third one, actually, this is as symbolic as I'm going to get right now in this video, but an investigation into the laws of thought by George Bull. Now, a lot of programmers will know that name because he pretty much invented the digital age with his things, but he, in his little algebra, Boolean algebra, and also known as calculus by some people, he's actually trying to look at how thinking is done. So you might see some familiar things like x plus 1, x minus 0, or whatever, or parentheses and all to try to symbolize different ways of thinking in terms of the syllogisms and the propositions and all. And it's a pretty good starter book when it comes to mathematical logic. So if you like this video, please like it, please comment, please subscribe. If you're new to the channel, please look at my older videos, and also remember to keep philosophical. Thank you.